of course, our charter members who have signed up to move into the new Carlisle Tower. And the great thing about our book festival is it's truly one of the largest seniors book festivals in the country, is that we engage the audience in an interactive platform. So when Elizabeth Crook came to talk about Monday about the UT Tower shooting, we had a lot of people in the audience who were actually there that day. We had Jim Donovan talked about his new book about the Apollo space mission, so it was great. There were people in the audience who had met the astronauts. So today, due to COVID, we've had to get creative with our author talks, and Kevin has graciously agreed to be our very first Zoom author guest, and I knew that he would be an expert with this, and as part of our lockdown series, we're going to bring on a few different authors, but he again has agreed to be our very first author. So Kevin is a friend. He's one of the most popular professors of sports writing and feature writing at the University of Texas Moody School of Journalism. Kevin, he is also a brilliant storyteller and one of the most knowledgeable sports writers in the country, especially on the subject of golf. Now, I know there are a lot of golfers who live at Westminster. You even have your own putting green. Today, you're going to hear Kevin's account about his nonfiction work about Payne Stewart, who died tragically in a plane crash. And he might touch on his 2016 portrayal of Harvey Payne, another bestseller about the man who wrote the book on golf. So here's a little bit more on Kevin and his backstory. He graduated from the University of Central Missouri and earned his master's at the Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. He joined the journalism faculty at UT in 2012. And for the past 22 years, though, he has written for a number of dailies, from the St. Louis Post to the Scripps Howard News Service in DC, where he also covered Congress, the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, and he attended his fair share of Rose Garden press conferences at the White House during the Clinton administration. But again, Kevin spent the bulk of his career at the Austin American-Statesman, familiar byline, where he became a sports writer in 2002. And over the years, Kevin has won a slew of prestigious national sports writing awards, including the AP Sports Editor Award for the National Writing Competition, and his work has been cited in the Notables section and 2 editions of the Best American Sports Writing Anthology. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Texas Monthly, ESPN, Travel and Leisure Golf, and of course the Golf Journal. And just last week, he covered the Colonial Tournament up in Fort Worth. I believe that's the first PGA Tour event since the COVID lockdown. So hopefully he will share some insights about that today, about how golf is acclimating to this really strange and surrealistic, but yet historic time in quarantine. So with this, again, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today for our very first Zoom talk, which will be recorded. And as a little housekeeping, I want to remind people, we will upload this to the YouTube channel. And if you would like to purchase Kevin's book, you can contact Ruth Sunil, who is really the Lord Mayor and High Sheriff of everything at Westminster. And we can work with Kevin to get those autographed copies. But you can also reach out to him directly through his author site and through his address at UT. So with that, Kevin, thank you so much. Please welcome Kevin Robbins.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. That was really nice. Hello, Westminster. Really glad that you mentioned this first book of mine about Harvey Payne. I wrote his biography. It was published in 2016. That was long after I visited Westminster because Helen Payne, Harvey's wife, lived the last years of her life at Westminster. Yes. So yeah, a neat little connection there. I remember her eyes. Helen had these bright blue eyes, and they almost looked electrified. I can still picture this sweet woman and her beautiful blue eyes at Westminster. So yes, so we're here to talk about this book. This book was published last October. It's called The Last Stand of Payne Stewart. It is part biography. It is part a reconstruction of the 1999 season on the PGA Tour, which was really remarkable and historic in a lot of ways. having nothing to do with Payne Stewart at all. There are some high points that I'll talk about soon, but it was really one of those magical seasons in golf, unforgettable to historians and fans alike. So one thing that I think authors get asked a lot about is, how did you get the idea for this book? And this document is the idea for this book. This is the final unredacted report from the National Transportation Safety Board about the incident in which Payne and 5 other people died in October of 1999. And I was just right here at this desk one evening in about 3.5 years ago. And I wasn't really looking for this. I wasn't looking for a book idea. But I stumbled upon this document. It's 1,482 pages long. It's a government report, so it has lots of detail, as government reports do, but no real story. It's an inventory of facts, not hunches, not theories, not speculation, but facts about what happened on that day in October of '99. And I got lost in this document, and I started thinking about possibly writing a book that would take place just on October 25th, 1999, which is the day of the flight. I have a really smart book agent, a man by the name of Jim Hornfisher, right here in Austin. And he's really good at distinguishing between what he calls magazine stories and books. Magazine stories are small and books are big. And he told me that he thought the idea of writing about the day was a good magazine story, but I needed to find something bigger to hook onto to make this a book. And that's how the idea became the whole season of '99 and the tournaments and the events that led up to October 25th, the day of the flight. So now I want to share with you a PowerPoint that I'm going to use. And I need to know that everybody can see this black and white portrait.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll start with a question. Who are we looking at here? Well, this is Payne Stewart, but it's also me, and it's also, I think, a lot of people who lived lives like Payne Stewart lived his. So Payne Stewart was born in 1957 in Springfield, Missouri, to a mattress salesman. His father sold box springs and other bed equipment. He was a traveling salesman. He had a big territory. His mother, Bee, was a sort of somewhat regionally famous Democratic activist, which was unusual because Springfield, Missouri, down in the southwest corner of the state, is very much Republican territory. So Bee was a bit of an outlier there. Payne had 2 older sisters. He was, of course, a gifted athlete. He was a great golfer, but he was also a 3-sport standout athlete in his high school in Springfield. He was a point guard on the basketball team, a quarterback on the football team, and he was a pitcher for the baseball team. As you can see, you know, he's a rather handsome fellow. He was long-limbed and lean and graceful, and very favored by girls and boys alike at his high school. And all of this to say that he was put on a pedestal at an early age. He was held up as being this ideal because he was such an outstanding athlete. And so he was treated differently. And I don't have to explain to you how, because all of you either were or know this person. And so his path was kind of paved, right? He attended Southern Methodist University in Dallas. I thought that was an unusual but beneficial choice for Payne, because he had lived in Springfield his whole life. Getting out of Springfield and coming to a big city like Dallas, I feel, broadened him and gave him new perspective on the world, showed him that the world is a big place. He joined a fraternity at SMU. He played on the golf team at SMU. He was quite honest about his college experience, that most of what he got out of it was social. He loved to have parties. He loved to make sure that people were having a good time around him. He liked to be the life of the party, and that was true of him his whole life. What he did not do at college was grow up much. So he very much remained even after graduating. And I should note, he graduated from SMU in 4 years. That is unusual for a college athlete, even a golfer. Typically, they either leave early to play their sport, or they don't graduate at all, or they take longer to graduate. But Payne graduated in 4 years, and he tried a few times to qualify for the PGA Tour. He was unsuccessful. Actually, Payne did not win a college golf tournament until his senior year, and he won 3, including the Southwest Conference Championship in Tyler, Texas. He also won a tournament, the University of Texas Invitational, right over at Morris Williams Golf Course on the east side of 35. So he was a bit of a late bloomer. He was someone who didn't really realize his potential until his senior year. Following his senior year, as I said, he tried to qualify for the PGA Tour. He was unsuccessful. So he ended up playing over in Asia and Australia on what we call now the Asian Tour. And Payne learned a lot living overseas. He learned how to live independently. He learned how to play a different kind of golf. He learned to find the love of his life. His wife, Tracy Stewart, the only wife he ever had, was from Australia, and he met her in Malaysia at a tour stop. But what he didn't do in Asia was grow up. And so he remained kind of this boy in perpetuity. And even though he was now in his mid-20s, he still sort of conducted himself like a 17-year-old in a lot of ways. And I mentioned this twice because it really informs the perception of and reputation and image of Payne Stewart all the way until his death in October of 1999. Payne finally made the PGA Tour in 1982. And he was 26 years old. And he arrived sort of brash and full of himself, and he carried himself with confidence, even cockiness, which is a word that a lot of people use to describe Payne Stewart. One thing, though, he didn't do, well, actually 2, his early years on the PGA Tour. First, he didn't win, and he had this gorgeous golf swing, and again, all the confidence in the world, but he wasn't a winner. The second thing he didn't do his early years on the PGA Tour, as I think you suspect, he didn't grow up. So he was someone who was very loud. And golf, as you know, is a sport and a place for silence and for quiet. Payne was neither of those. He did finally break through in 1984 and won his first golf tournament. And so now he's finally won. And he didn't stop winning. It seemed like that it was really hard for him to get that first victory, but once it happened, he continued to win. And by the time that we get to 1989, he has won his first major championship. He won the PGA Championship at Kemper Lakes outside of Chicago. Now, this was a really consequential moment for Payne. First, he had won his first major championship. That was a big deal, and a lot of people, including himself, were wondering when that would happen. But what he did in that moment, when the world of golf had its attention turned to him, it really it changed the way people looked at him. So here's what happened. It's the final round, and Payne Stewart is on the back nine, the last 9 holes of the tournament. And he puts together this really incredible string of great golf, and he makes some birdies, and he finishes with the low score for the day. So he's what they call the clubhouse leader. And he's in the scoring area waiting for the other players behind him to finish. There are other players who have a chance to win. Payne Stewart needs to find out if they're going to be able to accomplish that. And while the cameras are trained on him in the scoring area, Payne is sort of bouncing around and popping grapes, and he's like promoting the logos of corporate sponsors on his shirt. He's really sort of behaving like a wired up kid while he's waiting for the tournament to finish. What people expect out of golfers in this situation is for them to maybe go to the practice green and practice their putting while they wait to see if they're going to end up in a playoff, or maybe sit and watch the television with the interest to see, of who might finish with the same score or better. But Payne's not doing anything like that. You know, he's bouncing around. So it turns out that the only player who can catch him does not. And so Payne has won. And he enters the press room to talk to the media about his win. And again, this is where he kind of breaks the tradition in golf of how winners conduct themselves immediately after winning. Payne is loud, and he's sort of impulsive with his answers. They don't seem very well thought out. He's not very respectful of the players behind him who have lost this tournament. And indeed, Payne implies in his press conference that he was actually praying that the other players would fail in the end, and so Payne could win. So kind of what you would call bad form. Now, this doesn't really surprise people who've been paying attention to Payne's career. This is sort of who he is, but he's kind of taken it to the next level now. And instead of maturing through victory at this PGA championship, his immaturity seems to be amplified and magnified. I'm going to. So I want to stop there, and I want to tell you the question that I wanted to answer with this book. I wanted to find out if Payne Stewart deserved the image and the reputation that he had through his whole life. I wanted to find out if Payne was really that cocky, cocksure, immature, impetuous individual who didn't know how to conduct himself at the press conference after the PGA championship in '99. Or was that some sort of miscalculation on the part of the media and the public? When Payne Stewart died in 1999, for reasons that I'll go through here in a little while, his image and his reputation had changed completely, and people saw him in an entirely different way. So another question I wanted to answer was, did he deserve that? Had he changed as significantly as we remembered? And if so, what were the causes of that change? And that's what made my project different from the two other books that were written about Payne Stewart's life and were published right after his death. One of those books was written by a man named Larry Guest, who was a columnist for the Orlando newspaper where Payne lived in Orlando. And they were friends. They were friendly. They had a relationship. The other book was written by Tracy, his widow, and that was published shortly after his death too. Now, because one of the books was written by a friend and the other one was co-written by his wife, I suspected that there was a certain, because of the proximity, the emotional proximity between the authors and the subject, I suspected that the whole story might not have been told in those books. So the final question I wanted to answer, and that I really needed to answer to make this book work, was, is the documented life of Payne Stewart accurate? Now, this is the Payne Stewart I think a lot of people remember the most. This photograph was taken on Father's Day in 1999 at the conclusion of the US Open at Pinehurst in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Payne Stewart won that golf tournament at the age of 42. It was his 13th and final win on the PGA Tour. A lot had happened before this week in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and that's where we're going to begin. This is Payne Stewart in 1991, Father's Day, at the US Open at Hazeltine National in Chaska, Minnesota. This is Payne's second major championship. It came 2 years after he won the PGA in Chicago, and he had this brilliant run of golf between these two major championships. He literally looked like, at this moment, comparable would be Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson, I mean, Jack Nicklaus, Tom Watson, Lee Trevino, these golfers who would, accumulate dozens of victories on the PGA Tour, go on to a World Golf Hall of Fame career that might end on the Champions Tour. He looked unstoppable. But what happened was, well, he was stoppable. He stopped himself. After this win at the US Open in 1991, he made a series of decisions about his schedule and the equipment that he played that would basically torpedo the next few years of his career on the PGA Tour. He started traveling the globe for appearances internationally. He played a lot of golf tournaments and kind of wore himself out. And he also did something that elite golfers, PGA Tour players, don't frequently do, and that is he changed his entire inventory of equipment. New woods, new irons, new golf ball. And he did this because a company called Spalding offered him a very generous endorsement contract to do this. And so he basically chased the money. And the problem was the new equipment that he signed to play was not right for him. And so he stopped winning. He went for a period of 8 years with only one victory on the tour between 91 and 98. And that victory, which came in Houston at the Shell Houston Open, it happened basically because another player lost the lead on the last 9 holes, and Payne just kind of like backed into this victory. These were very lean years for Payne Stewart professionally and personally. He was not making the kind of money that he was used to. He was not contending in as many tournaments as he had been. And consequently, people turned their attention away from him. And this was unusual. Payne was a guy accustomed to the limelight, to attention. You might remember that he wore this very memorable ensemble every time he played. You can see here he's wearing a touring cap or a flat cap. You can see also that he's wearing very bright colors on his shirt. That's something he often did. What you can't see, but you certainly do remember, is he wore these bloused trousers called +4s. Otherwise, some people know them as knickers. And he wore silk hose, and he wore golf shoes with gold tips. He's very much a peacock. He was a brand before brands were brands on the PGA Tour. This was his look. So here he was in the 90s, this man who wore these outrageous clothes on the golf course, who had had this flurry of victories in the late 80s and early 90s, and now all of a sudden, nothing.
Those are some fancy.
Yes, aren't they?
Younger.
I wish I could pull off that look, because you can see this is the Payne Stewart look people remember. So before we get to this moment, which is the Friday of the 1998 U.S. Open at the Olympic Club in San Francisco, I just want to revisit and re-emphasize this wilderness that Stewart was in between 1991 and 1998. It was a time, I think, when he did a lot of soul searching. He perhaps was taking inventory of his life. He was thinking about what might come after golf, because there was enough doubt in his head at this point that he truly wondered if he could ever play great golf again. And he often wondered if he even wanted to. Another thing happened in this period between 91 and 98 that made a lasting impact on his life. His best friend on the PGA Tour was a guy named Paul Azinger. And like Payne, Paul had struggled to win early on the PGA Tour, finally did, and then he too won his first major championship. In 1993, Paul Azinger was diagnosed with lymphoma, and he had to take, of course, a break from competition. Paul lived in Tampa, and Payne lived in Orlando. So they saw each other frequently when they weren't playing golf. Well, during this period, Paul, undergoing treatment for his cancer, had to stay home. And not a lot of his friends on the PGA Tour checked in on him. But this man did. Payne Stewart did. Payne often drove over to Tampa, and he and Paul would go out and go fishing. They didn't really talk about, they didn't have serious discussions about mortality or the meaning of life or anything like that. These men, that was not their way. They kept it light. But Paul told me, and Paul was the last extensive interview I did for this book. He told me that meant something to him, that Payne would make the time to come over from Orlando and just be with him in the boat while they were fishing, talking about college football or whatever. It meant something to Paul that Payne would do this, just his presence. And I thought a lot about that. And when on my quest to answer those questions that I mentioned earlier, um, I became convinced that Paul wasn't the only beneficiary of that time together, that Payne was too. Because again, remember, these are the 93 is right in the middle of this slump that Payne was suffering on the PGA Tour. And he was doing he was becoming more introspective, and he was doing some deep thinking about the meaning of things. And that coincided with this experience with Paul, with his friend Paul Azinger, who was dealing with cancer and who was definitely confronting like end of life questions. Even though Paul was going to be fine and is fine now, he's one of the best broadcasters in golf on Fox. And so I really believe that Payne was thinking a lot about his own life through Paul's experience. And I believe that he began asking himself questions that he had never asked himself, such as, what kind of person am I? And if I were Paul Azinger right now facing potentially mortality, what would I leave behind? And have I been a good steward of the game? And have I been a good husband? Have I been a good father? And what do these things even mean? For the first time in his life now, Payne Stewart is beginning to grow up. But what he hasn't done is return to the level of golf that he had once enjoyed until this moment right here on the screen. Now, this is Friday at the 1998 US Open at the Olympic Club. Payne Stewart came to that tournament as no one's favorite. He was on no one's like top 10 players to watch because he had been in this terrible slump. But he did this amazing thing. In the first round, he shot a 4 under par 66, a flawless round of golf. And at a US Open, those are so rare on an incredibly hard golf course. And he followed that on this day with another under par round. The only real difficulty he faced on that Friday at the US Open is captured right here in this picture. I'll take you to the 2 minutes before this photograph was taken. Payne had a 12-foot putt for a birdie 3 on the 18th hole. The hole on the green that day was cut on a side slope that was later agreed to by the United States Golf Association as being borderline unfair. Payne hit his putt and it caught the bottom edge of the hole, slung out, and now Payne, right here in this photograph, is surveying his 20-foot putt for par. So he's just missed a 12-foot putt, and now he has a 20-foot putt left. That tells you how severe the slope was on that green. He's clearly annoyed here. He's sort of fuming on the inside. He misses the putt. He makes a bogey. A younger Payne Stewart would have complained loudly about the unfairness of the whole situation, that the hole was cut on an unfair slope. He might have even blamed spectators for talking in his backstroke on the putt that he missed. In other words, he would have looked for a lot of external reasons about why this happened, rather than taking ownership and responsibility for it. That's what a younger Payne Stewart would have done. But this Payne Stewart at the age of 41, he walked into the press center at the Olympic Club and took complete responsibility for missing the putt. And he absolutely refused to blame anyone, the course setup people, the person who cut the hole, the United States Golf Association, the golf gods, spectators. He took responsibility himself. And this this is a meaningful and symbolic moment, because it's really the first time, honestly, where people have seen and heard maybe a new Payne Stewart, maybe someone who has changed. Payne Stewart did not win that United States Open. He had the lead in the middle of the fourth round, but he caught some bad breaks, and a player by the name of Lee Janzen caught some good breaks, and Stewart ended up missing a 10-foot putt on the 72nd hole, the 18th hole of that Sunday round, to tie Lee Janzen and force a playoff. So Lee Janzen won by one, Payne Stewart lost by one, but all week long, he had been showing anyone who was paying attention that he was perhaps a different person, that maybe by now he was beginning to grow up. The 1998 season ends. Payne Stewart does not win a tournament, but that second place finish at the US Open, it meant something. And he came into the 99 season with a new commitment to his game. And this moment here was captured at another California golf course, Pebble Beach Golf Links. This is at the Pebble Beach Pro-Am, a tournament that has been on the PGA Tour schedule in the spring for decades, a very popular tournament. It's a tournament that Payne often played well, even when he was in his slump. You might know that the Pebble Beach Pro-Am is annually plagued by bad weather. It's played again early in the season. The weather's a little unpredictable on the Monterey Peninsula, as it was this year. At the conclusion of play, after 3 rounds, a huge storm came in, wind and rain soaked the course, and then it just settled right over Pebble Beach. And so the next day, the PGA Tour canceled the final round and made it a 3-round tournament. Well, that was fortunate for Stewart, because he had a 1-stroke lead at the conclusion of play on Saturday. So he was declared the winner because the final round was canceled. In his, you're hearing me often refer to post-round media availabilities and press conferences. Yes, I use those a lot for this book, because the transcriptions of those interviews are available online, and they're as close to an actual conversation that I could get for something that happened 20 years ago. I did use lots of television coverage as well, and some television interviews, but I wanted my story in the book to be told as if it were happening right in front of you. And so anything that I quoted, it needed to be a conversation that happened in the moment during that year of 1999. In other words, I did interview people like Paul Azinger and 80 other people for this book, but nowhere in the book do you hear those subjects reflecting on what happened in 99. No one says, I remember when Payne put a banana in my shoe at the memorial, which is something that happened. So the transcriptions of these press conferences were very important to me, because I literally have the verbatim question and then Payne's verbatim answer. And in this press conference after the Pebble Beach Pro-Am, Payne is asked some questions that, as a younger man, he would have bristled at those questions, and he would have answered in as few words as possible, because he, like many professional athletes, didn't really enjoy the athlete-reporter relationship. But something was different here in February of 1999. Something was different about Payne. he was asked a question about what made the difference this week for him. And he talked about his experience with the slump and how that had given him time to reappraise his life and his values and what he cared about. He was asked about 1998 at the US Open and how he was more friendly and cooperative with the media there. And Payne made a confession at Pebble Beach to the reporters that surprised a lot of people, but also signaled that he was becoming a different person. He said that he didn't used to understand the job that reporters did at golf tournaments. He said that as a younger player, he thought that reporters should be on his side and should be positive and promotional in their coverage rather than neutral and objective. And Payne said after this tournament at Pebble Beach, I understand your job now. And I understand it's not your job to promote me. It's your job to write about what you see and hear, what you see me do and what you hear me say. So this also tells us that Payne is becoming more mature. He's becoming more self-actualized, and he's becoming more self-aware. Sunday, Father's Day, 1999. You can see here back in the distance on the little leaderboard here, it says Happy Father's Day, as it does every Sunday except this one at the United States Open, the national championship. So much had happened before this moment. This moment is one of the most famous in the history of golf now. This is the moment when the ball has just rolled into the cup on the 72nd hole of the final of the US Open at Pinehurst, the final round Sunday. Payne has just made an 18-foot putt to win the United States Open. I have to tell you what happened before this. The week before this championship, Stewart missed the cut badly in Memphis, and he had not won since Pebble Beach. You'll remember that Pebble Beach was shortened to 3 rounds. It was a 54-hole tournament. Payne was glad to get the trophy. He was glad to cash the check. But inside, he wondered if he could win a 4-round tournament. He wondered if he could win a PGA Tour event that went all 4 rounds. He had proved that he could win again, but it sort of came with a caveat. Like, it was only 3 rounds. He didn't get to see what he would do on Sunday. So he missed the cut badly in Memphis the week before the US Open. He and his caddy and his golf teacher, a guy who lives right here in Austin named Chuck Cook, they went to North Carolina on the Saturday before the US Open because he had missed the cut in Memphis. He had the 2 extra days. And they went out, they really studied this golf course, Pinehurst number 2. And they figured out its secrets. They figured out not how to play well on it, but how not to play badly. Now, this is an interesting development too, because as a younger player, Payne was aggressive, bold, often to his demise. In other words, he wasn't a very cautious and wise golfer. The preparation paid off. And on the final round that Sunday, he was in the last group with a young left-hander from San Diego who Mary, if she's still here, remembers Phil Mickelson. And Phil was now 29 years old. He had won plenty of golf tournaments, but he still hadn't won a major yet. So does that sound familiar? It's a little bit like Payne Stewart many years ago, right? He had been on the tour. He was very popular, very distinct, had character, had a style, but still hadn't won a major championship. It was an epic, historic, significant, and important final round for these two players because they both played their best golf, both Phil Mickelson and Payne Stewart. And they were nip and tuck the whole day. Payne had the lead, then Phil would have the lead, then they were tied, and then they were neck and neck. Briefly, David Duval, the former world #1, was in contention. A young player by the name of Tiger Woods was in contention. It really was a U.S. Open for the ages. At the 16th hole, which is a long par 4 at Pinehurst #2, at the time it was like 480 yards, the longest par 4 in the history of the U.S. Open. That has since been eclipsed many times over. At that hole, Payne Stewart makes a long 25-foot putt to save par that breaks two ways. Phil Mickelson has about an 8-footer to save par. He misses. They're tied. They go to the 17th hole. As you can see, it's kind of a misty, gray, cool day in the Sandhills of North Carolina. And this is the first U.S. Open at Pinehurst in the history of this famous, celebrated golf resort. And it seems like all of North Carolina and some of South Carolina has turned out for this tournament. You can see the fans here and how they're about 15 deep on the 18th green. Well, it was that way for the whole course. And on the 17th, which is a par 3, it looked like a soccer stadium. The hole travels over a valley. And when Payne Stewart and Phil Mickelson are on the tee getting ready to hit, tied for the lead of the US Open, all they can see are people. Payne Stewart hits first. He had the honor because he made the par on 16. He hits it to about 8 feet. The crowd erupts. The noise is echoing through the pine trees. Phil Mickelson steps up. He knows he has to hit a good shot, and he does. He hits his a little inside Payne Stewart. So 2 really good shots in incredible US Open pressure. They get to the green, and remember, they're tied. And by this time, they can look at the leaderboard and they can realize that nobody else can win this tournament. It's going to come down to one of them. At the 17th hole, Phil misses his putt and Payne makes his. So now Payne Stewart has a 1-shot lead on the last hole of the 99 US Open. He is trying to forget all of the ghosts from his whole life in competition, including the year before at the 1998 US Open, where he lost by 1 to Lee Janzen. He steps up and he hits a tee shot on the 18th hole, which is a par 4 at Pinehurst, that just kind of bounds slightly into the rough, the longer grass on the right side of the fairway. Phil Mickelson gets up there and hits a great drive right in the middle of the fairway. So now advantage Phil. As Payne Stewart is walking up the hill to find his ball, he has a choice to make. It's a choice that any of us who play golf have to make anytime we hit a shot that we don't like and that ends up in a bad spot. Do I play the bold shot and try to hit it on the green? Or do I play a cautious shot just to get out of this bad situation so that things don't get worse? Because any bold shot has risk. So is Payne going to play the safe shot, or is he going to take the risk? The younger Payne Stewart, there would have been no choice at all. He would have played the bold shot. That's who he was. That's who he had been. That's who he had always been. He was once interviewed by a reporter about the so-called recovery shot. A recovery shot is when you're in the rough on a long hole and the risk is too great to try to hit it to the green. So you just take a shorter club, a safer club like a wedge, and you chop it back out into the fairway and you play in from there, eliminating all risk of losing a ball or just making matters worse. Payne Stewart called that the most boring shot in golf when he was a younger player. The most boring shot in golf, disparaging. Well, now on Sunday at the US Open on the 72nd hole in 1999, his choice is the most boring shot in golf or high risk. It's the US Open. He has a one-shot lead. He makes the safe choice. He asks his caddy for a wedge. He chops it out back into the fairway. Meanwhile, Phil Mickelson hits his second shot to the green. So still advantage Phil. Phil makes that putt up there. He can tie Payne or possibly beat him. Well, this is another moment, I believe, in this season of 1999 where Payne Stewart is showing the world, he's showing anybody who's paying attention that he is not the man he used to be, because he has not taken this bold risk, and instead he's playing this shot that is cautious and conservative. The one that he disparaged is boring, but it's the shot that Nicklaus would have played. It's the shot that Snead would have played, that Nelson, Hogan, all the way back to Bobby Jones. The great players know when the risk is too great, especially in a tournament of this magnitude. Funny thing happens. Payne gets over that third shot on the par 4. He hits it to 18 feet, and he goes up there and he makes the putt, and Phil misses his. And that's what happened in this frame is Payne is sinking that putt to win the US Open. It's incredible. He's 42 years old. He hasn't won anything since 1995. Many people had given up on him. Payne Stewart had given up on himself a few times even. But this happened. And this video of this moment on YouTube exists, and it's really, really poignant to watch. So Payne makes the putt. He strikes this pose. He finds his caddy. He puts his caddy in his arms, lifts him off of his feet, puts him down. And then in this moment of near delirium, he regains his composure and he remembers that while this is a terrific moment for him, that this is a great triumph for him, that somebody else suffered because he beat somebody with this putt. And that was that 29-year-old Phil Mickelson, who was going to be a father very soon. His wife, Amy, was back home pregnant with their first child, Amanda. And at any moment, the pager in his golf bag might have gone off that week, and he would have flown back to California to witness the birth of his first child. So Payne, after lifting up his caddy, regains his composure, and he remembers that Phil Mickelson must be really hurting right now. And he walks over to Phil and he puts his hands on Phil's cheeks like this. And he says something to the effect of, "You will have your chance again. You will win yours. Plus, this isn't even the important thing. The important thing is that you're going to be a father." He's saying this on Father's Day. Yeah. And, again, here's another gesture. Here is more evidence, if you're paying attention, that Payne Stewart has changed. Something has happened. A younger Payne Stewart would not have had that presence of mind to go over to a Phil Mickelson and express empathy and compassion, but that's what he did that day. I mean, his caddy, Mike Hicks, one of the best experiences I've had reporting a book. Back in the summer of 2018, I went to Pinehurst to meet Mike Hicks, his caddy, and to see this golf course for the first time. So Mike Hicks and I had dinner at the Carolina Hotel. We had a couple of drinks too, and it was getting late in the day. It was a beautiful summer late afternoon, early evening. The long shadows starting to form across the fairways, and Hicks said, "Let's go walk the last 3 holes. I'll take you through every step." And so we walked 16 and 17 and 18. And as we're walking from the place where Payne Stewart hit his 3rd shot on the 18th hole to the green where he made this putt, Hicks told me probably for the 5th time, you know, the Payne Stewart I thought I knew, he would not have chosen to make that play first, the most boring shot in golf, and he would not have had the presence of mind to go to Phil Mickelson and say, basically, "I'm sorry." Later that summer, actually in the fall, this is September of 1999, at the country club at Brookline outside of Boston, Massachusetts, the Ryder Cup matches. Everybody remembers this Ryder Cup. Everybody remembers it because the Americans were down to the European team by what looked to be an insurmountable 4 points. For those of you who don't know, the Ryder Cup matches are held every other year. This is a Ryder Cup year. And they are matches between 12 American players and 12 European players. And they can get hostile and they can get fiery. They're typically a joy to watch. Sometimes the fans get a little out of hand, as they did this year at Brookline. This turned out to be a rather ugly Ryder Cup. Payne Stewart had made the team by virtue of his win at the US Open. He didn't particularly play well the first couple of days, but by the time it got to Sunday, what they call single Sunday, when players from Europe and the US play head-to-head instead of in little team matches, he was starting to get some form back. The players you see here are Payne in his flat cap and the burgundy flat cap, and the other guy is Colin Montgomerie, who is from Scotland. Colin was a young player whose reputation and attitude very much resembled Payne's when he was young. Colin was not well liked in the United States. He, like a younger Payne Stewart, would tend to blame outside external forces when he didn't play his best golf. And on this Sunday in Massachusetts, the American spectators were really on Colin Montgomerie the whole day. They were calling him names. They were using profanity. At one point, Colin's father and wife were walking from one green to a tee, and somebody threw a beer on him. It was just a really kind of ugly day for American fandom in sports on this day. Colin and Payne Stewart were playing in one of the later matches. In fact, they were playing right behind the match involving Justin Leonard of the United States and Jose Maria Olazabal of Spain. The reason I mentioned that match is because on the 17th green on this Sunday, Justin Leonard made a long putt to basically win the Ryder Cup for the United States and complete this amazing, unprecedented comeback on Singles Sunday. Colin Montgomerie and Payne Stewart watched that unfold from about 150 yards. And when the big celebration, the controversial celebration on the green had run its course, and Olazabal had accepted defeat, meaning the Americans had just won the cup, Stewart and Montgomery were the last match on the course. Everybody else was done. They didn't have to play it out. The cup had been won by the United States team, but they did. And on the 18th hole, Colin Montgomery had about a 30-foot putt for birdie, and Payne Stewart had a 20-foot putt for par. And they are at this moment tied or all square in their match. And Payne Stewart walked over to Montgomery and picked up his coin that he had been used to mark his ball. He extended his hand and he said, "I think we've had enough of this today, wouldn't you?" And Colin, who was shocked, composed himself and said, "I think you're right." What had just happened was Payne Stewart had gone to Colin Montgomery and conceded the Ryder Cup match. He basically said, "You win, I lose. Let's go home." Again, so atypical for Payne Stewart, who was incredibly competitive, who was incredibly protective of his Ryder Cup record. For him to concede, basically surrender a Ryder Cup match, especially to someone like Colin Montgomery, just seemed highly unusual. But I would say, again, it's just one more piece of evidence and one more moment where Payne Stewart is showing the world, if they're paying attention, I'm a different guy. So this is the last enduring image of Payne Stewart, last public image of Payne Stewart, because at the conclusion of the Ryder Cup, Payne goes over and plays a golf tournament in Scotland. Then he comes home and he plays the golf tournament in his hometown of Orlando, the Disney. He misses the cut. So he's not been on TV anymore. Nobody's taken his picture. It's not going to, not asked to come in to answer questions from reporters. And then the following Monday, he gets on a plane at Orlando International Airport. It's October 25th now. He's getting on a Learjet 35, which is a really fast, sleek business jet. He's going to fly to Dallas to look at some property that he might help to develop into a golf course for his alma mater, SMU. And then from there, he's going to fly later that Monday evening to Houston for the last tournament of the season, the Tour Championship. Tour Championship's only 30 players. It's only the top 30 money earners of the season. Very elite, very prestigious, very lucrative. And then after that, Payne has decided he's going to shut it down. He's going to spend the off season in Orlando with his kids, Aaron and Chelsea, who are 9 and 12. He's going to spend that quality time with his wife, Tracy. He's not going to do what he used to do, which is goof off, go fishing, drink a lot of beer, maybe play a lot of golf. He's going to reground himself. So it's a nice morning for flying on October 25th, 99 in Orlando. There's no real cloud cover. There's no real wind. The two pilots who were flying him on that private plane that day are board. One of them, the captain, is an Air Force veteran, thousands of hours of some flying time. The pilot not flying, or the co-pilot that day, is a young woman from Ohio who's been a pilot she's 27. She's been a pilot for a long time too. She's not as experienced as the captain, but again, a very able aviator, very responsible pilots, both of them. The plane is 25 years old. It's a Learjet 35, as I mentioned. It's had some work. It's had to. It's been in service a long time, but it's a reliable aircraft. And on board with Stewart that day are 3 other passengers. 2 of them represent him in his business transactions. They're his agents. And the other one is a golf course architect from Jack Nicklaus's firm who's going to go look at this land in Dallas with Payne. The plane takes off, and there's some typical communication back and forth between the pilots and the tower that's controlling the flight at that time. The tower is telling the pilots to fly to a certain altitude and then hit a certain bearing to head to Dallas. About 8 minutes into the flight, the plane is still ascending. It's supposed to go to 35,000 feet. The pilot not flying, the young 27-year-old woman from Ohio, she acknowledges the direction to the instruction to level off at 35,000 feet. And those are the last words that are ever heard from the cockpit of the airplane. The airplane continues to rise, to ascend well beyond 35,000 feet. And when it's supposed to bear left or west to Texas over Plant City, Florida, it keeps flying straight. So immediately, the aviation community in Florida knows that something is wrong. They can't reach the pilot. They can't reach the co-pilot. The plane has not turned to the west, and it is not leveled off at 35,000. It's continuing to climb. So the towers enlist the help of commercial pilots in the area. The commercial flights observe the plane. It just seems to be going straight up because that's what it was doing. An Air Force captain in the panhandle of Florida is activated, told to go have a look. The Air Force pilot gets very close to the Learjet. Now they're at about 45,000 feet, flying really fast. Their wings are almost touching. This is how close the Air Force pilot got to the Learjet 35. The Air Force pilot can see nothing through the windows. The windows are frosted. And so he reports that back. Now all of the smart people on the ground are beginning to make conclusions about what might be happening in this airplane that Payne Stewart is in. And the most obvious one is that the cabin has not pressurized. And the windows are frosted because it's 60 degrees below zero inside the airplane now. There's no oxygen in the airplane. So everybody aboard has died from a condition called hypoxia, which is something that pilots have to deal with at high altitude unless they put on oxygen. The plane flies for 4 hours, travels over Memphis, over St. Louis. It's going straight up the middle of America. It is always escorted with military pilots. There were rumors that day that the military was considering shooting down the airplane. That was not true. That was just a rumor. They were the FAA and people on the ground were able to understand that given the conditions and the type of aircraft and the amount of fuel on board, that it would likely go down in a remote area. And that's exactly what happened. It ran out of gas over South Dakota, over a prairie. It was 8 miles in the air when its last engine quit, and it came straight down, and it just it didn't explode on impact because it didn't have any gasoline left, but it just disintegrated on impact. And this was about 12:30 Central Time. So the plane had been in the air for about 4.5 hours. One of the more productive series of interviews I did was with a guy named Bob Benson, who was the investigator in charge in South Dakota. He was sent from Washington, D.C. to South Dakota to investigate this crash. Benson was very helpful. He had a great memory, and he was also able and patient enough to work through this report with me. And here's the big point that he made, that an NTSB report, it's called a factual report. And so it's only what did happen. And what did happen is that this plane lost communication with ground 8 minutes into the flight, and then it kept rising, and it flew until it ran out of fuel. Those are the facts. The NTSB's job is to figure out what led to this. They couldn't, because the plane was 8 miles in the air when it ran out of gas. It came down almost at the speed of sound. And so there was nothing left. There's nothing left to piece together to figure out what might have happened. There was no black box on this particular airplane. They had no data. All they had was experience. And experience told them that in a situation like that, given given the facts that they knew, that what likely happened is that the plane either depressurized early into its flight or never pressurized on its ascent, and that everybody aboard simply went to sleep. The symptoms of hypoxia, I mean, I'm not trying to be flip here, but they are rather pleasant. You feel euphoric, you feel good, you feel confident, you might feel a little lightheaded, and in the later onset of hypoxia, right before you lose consciousness, you might begin to get a headache. But that's likely what happened. So Benson told me that this was the least mysterious mystery in the history of aviation, because they'll never be able to prove what did happen on that plane. But there's only one thing that could have happened, and that was the depressurization of the cabin. So it was really a sudden, tragic, remarkable, and very public end to the life of Payne Stewart. And it happened at the end of a season in which he had shown anyone paying attention that he was no longer the punk kid he used to be, that he had grown up. And you'll remember at the beginning of my talk with you, I showed you that black and white image of Payne, and I said, "Who do you see?" Well, it was a portrait of Payne Stewart, but I told you it also was me, and it was also maybe many of you watching. And here's why I said that, because, and this is what appealed to me to write about Payne for this book, that Payne lived a life like a lot of us live. When we're young, we make decisions that we wish we could take back. We say things that we regret. We do things that we're embarrassed of. And that was me. I saw a lot of myself in Payne Stewart. I didn't do the same things he did, and I certainly didn't win millions of dollars on the golf tour, but in a lot of ways, we had similar lives. And I think that he lived a life that's similar to that's relatable to a lot of people, maybe everybody. And so we have a choice, don't we? At some point in our lives, we can continue to be who we've always been, or we can come to some decisions and some realizations, and we can make changes. And that's what Payne Stewart was doing in 1998, 99. He had made some decisions, and he had come to some realizations, and he was changing who he was, and he was showing the world through these moments that he was becoming a different person. So back to my questions. Did he deserve the reputation that he had? Yes, he did. Had he changed as much as we thought we knew in 99? I don't know. But he was on his way, and he was making changes, and that's what's important. The only man who could ever tell us if he was truly changed is the guy who died on October 25th, 1999. So all we're left with, like the NTSB, is facts. And that's what I used to build this story. Yes, Mary.
Oh, go ahead. I have to leave now, but have you seen the statue at Pinehurst? Was it there when you were there?
Oh, yes.
I saw it in the Golf Journal, and now I see it is taken from that.
Yes.
That I didn't know that, so I was glad to see that.
Yeah, Mary, I heard at Pinehurst that was the most photographed statue in golf.
I wouldn't doubt it. All right, I'm sorry I have to leave, but I certainly enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you, Mary. Great to see you. Great to meet you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This is the scene of the crash in Minot, South Dakota. This is the parking space at the Tour Championship in Houston, where Payne Stewart was supposed to play, and it became this kind of memorial or tribute or altar to Stewart's life. At the Tour Championship, which went on as planned, there were talks of canceling it, but the tour decided to go ahead and conduct the Tour Championship without Payne. They went back on the Friday. The players went back on a chartered jet to Orlando to go to the memorial service in Florida. They did not play on that Friday, but they did play on Thursday, the first round, and they started at 7 o'clock in the morning with a little prayer service led by Tom Lehman, and a bagpiper played at that service. And this is a picture taken from that morning in Houston. Later that week, many players wore Argyle socks and +4s in honor of Stewart. A year later, at the US Open at Pebble Beach, where Payne would have been the defending champion, a few players, including Phil Mickelson, you can see with the left-handed swing, and the guy in jeans is Stewart's caddy, Mike Hicks. Oh. They hit kind of a tribute shot all together on the 18th hole in memory of Stewart. And one of the trips that I made to Orlando in the reporting of this book, I was riding around with a guy named John Brindle, who was a PGA Tour rules official and was Payne Stewart's next door neighbor. And John took me to Payne's grave, which is in a private cemetery. Only a handful of people know where this is. It's literally where we are right now in this photograph is about 75 yards from one of the busiest roads in Orlando, Florida, right near Bay Hill. But this grave is kind of up on a little hill, and you can't see it from the road, and you got to know where you're going to get there. But you might notice that the tattered American flag here, and there's a little golf ball that somebody has left, somebody in his family. So yes, so at any rate, that's kind of the story about what I was after and the questions I wanted to ask, and why I thought this was a universal story that many people could relate to. So I'm happy to take your questions if you have any.
Yeah, Kevin, this is Ann Keene. That was great. Are you still in touch with the family after the publication of the book?
I never really was in touch with the family, and so I did go to Springfield. And I spent 2 days with his sisters who still live there, and they were very helpful with the reporting of the book. Payne's widow, Tracy, I knew that I would need sort of her blessing to do this book if I had any hope of getting other people to talk to me. I knew that players like Paul Azinger or Tom Lehman, that they would want to know if Tracy was on board with this before they spoke with me. And Tracy was really good to give me that blessing without dictating in any way whatsoever my approach to documenting her husband's life. Her one request was that if I learned something about her husband that was, let's say, negative, that had never been reported before, she wanted me to tell her first. I thought that was fair. Tracy did not agree to do an interview with me for the book. That was fine too, because I had her book, her biography of her husband. And honestly, Ann, I didn't see the value in dragging her through this experience one more time.
Yeah.
So I was fine with the conditions and circumstances that I dealt with for the book, because everybody else did talk to me. I talked to 25 players of his generation. I talked to his sisters. I talked to his teammates at SMU. I talked to his best friends like John Brindle. I got what I needed to get, and I didn't need Tracy.
Kevin, thank you. This was fantastic. I've never heard much of him, so it was wonderful to listen to his story.
Thanks,
But over again, you kept mentioning that something changed in him, something, and he had to made some decisions that made him a different person.
Yeah.
Can you throw some light on that? Any idea on what those decisions could be?
Well, sure. Yeah. So I tried to imply one, and that is that, or a couple. So the first one, I believe, was the illness of his friend Paul Azinger, and those days that he spent with Paul in the boat, where he just was present. And I believe that the timing of that, at the onset of his slump, that coincidental confluence of those two things, that forced him to think about the rest of his life in a different way. He wasn't riding high anymore. He wasn't, globe trotting, playing in a different tournament every week. A lifestyle like that, it's hard to have time for yourself to think about things. Everything's happening so fast, and there's always something to do and somewhere to be. But at this point in 1993, when his friend is sick and he's undergoing this slump, missing a lot of cuts, spending more time at home, it gave him not just the time but the occasion to do some deep thinking, the kind that he had never done in his whole life. One thing that I didn't mention is, and it was part of the storyline at the U.S. Open at Pinehurst, Payne's kids went to a private Baptist school in Orlando. And Payne, he grew up in a church, in a Methodist church in Springfield, but he was not a real faithful, practicing Christian, even as a father and a husband later in life. But his kids, who went to this private school, Baptist school in Orlando, they were learning about the Bible for the first time, and they were coming home and saying, "Hey, Dad, today I learned about this or that, the saints, Corinthians, whatever." And again, it's this coincidental, it's a timing factor. So Payne is in this slump and going through this tough personal situation with his friend. And now his kids are coming home enthusiastically talking about the Bible and what they were learning at First Baptist. And I think Payne was looking for something like that to make sense of his life. And so he became, I wouldn't say, he certainly wasn't born again Christian at all, but he became more interested in faith and religion at that point. And he started wearing this bracelet, this little rubber bracelet that said WWJD, what would Jesus do? And he was wearing that at the US Open at Pinehurst, and he was asked about it by reporters. And Payne was like, basically, it was almost confessional at the press conference where he said, I wasn't happy with my life. And he wasn't saying it, but he was borderline alcoholic, and he was headed down a bad road. He was never abusive with his family or anything like that. But he was drinking too much and staying out too late. And I think that's what he was getting at Pinehurst, partially, was he realized that if he didn't make some fixes, he could be in for some real trouble. And this WWJD bracelet represented his commitment to changing his life and going towards something more spiritual. So I think it was those three things, Ruth. And then he's 42 years old. And I think we all grow up at different times. And It just took it took Payne Stewart a long time to grow up.
Makes a lot of sense now. Yes.
Yeah. I do, and I write with I write a lot about that in the book. It's just, it's not something I can typically get into in a book talk because it takes too long. Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
If there are any other questions? Go ahead, Bergen, go ahead.
Hi, it's Bergen. I'm trying to restart my video. I mean, he was a colorful personality in golf.
Oh, yeah.
But golf has many colorful personalities and lots of ego and lots of people who have great highs and great lows. I mean, my husband calls Phil Mickelson Choky Chicken because every time he gets close to, it seemed like for years, every time he got close to it, he'd almost be there and then he'd fail, right? And it was just like so frustrating. You wanted him to win something. But I mean, is he really, and they're playboys out there, right? They're people that just kind of treat people badly. Like what made you think that Payne Stewart, and you've described it, but what made you think that Payne Stewart was really all that different from every other professional golfer who is treated very special as a college athlete?
Yeah.
Given things. Why was he so different?
A few ways. I'm gonna start with the obvious one. The suddenness of his death and the very public way he died. CNN, all the news networks cut from their regular programming to go live about this, what they called a ghost flight or a rogue flight.
Oh, I remember watching that plane.
We all do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all do. So just the drama of the way he died, that makes him different. And he was so bigger than life. He had this costume that he wore, and a lot of people disparage athletes for not having a voice, for when they do speak publicly, it's very restrained and feels programmed and cliched. Payne wasn't that. Payne said what was on his mind, and that's partially what got him into trouble as a younger man, but people still loved him too. Like I set up a function on my tweet deck on Twitter so that anytime Payne Stewart's mentioned, I can see it. And completely unrelated to me or my book, like these people who are posting about Payne Stewart, they might not even know about the book. But so many people every day think about Payne Stewart for some reason, and they'll write that he was their favorite, and why was that? Well, he cut a certain figure out there, and he had a look, and he had a style, and he had a brand. And I think that's one of the things too. You look on the PGA Tour now, there are not many. There are some. Phil Mickelson's one, Bryson DeChambeau, Tiger. I mean, some personalities on the PGA Tour truly do stand apart, but most of them don't. And that's just like golf culture. So Payne Stewart, because he stood out, made him an exception. So that's another reason too. And everybody remembers that U.S. Open, going to Phil with his hands. They remember that Ryder Cup and that concession to Colin Montgomery. So there was a lot to work with there.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't realize, like when I shared my screen, I couldn't see my clock. I've been babbling a long time. I'm sorry. And next time,
no, it was really interesting.
This is great, Kevin. I mean, really, this is going to be really special, and we'll share this. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was just great. I feel like I really know him now.
I know. I felt like that too, but at least you all knew more about him than I did. So for me, it was really good. I'll probably read your book and learn more about him now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. And people certainly know how to reach out to Ruth, and we can work with Ruth to maybe secure some autographed copies. And
Sure.
I'm sure you'll get some questions as people watch the YouTube, especially.
Yeah, I will.
Quarantine.
I'll fit my next task will be to figure out how to end that. Transfer it to YouTube, but I'll figure it out and I'll let you know.
Well, this
Thank
is
you
great.
so much.
All right, thank you, you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank
Maybe
you.
when
Take care.
everything, all of this pandemic and everything dies down, we would love to have you come over to Westminster.
Yeah, I'd love that. That'd be great.
Thank you,
Okay.
Kevin.
Thanks,
God bless
everybody.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.